I'm pleased to be here to talk about climate change and extreme weather events in Canada. Not adapting is not an option. In reference to this title and this subject, over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we will consider the following questions, or we'll follow the following agenda. First, I'm going to say a little bit about the fact that climate change is real. Climate change has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen. And my guess is most of the people in this room are on board to the fact that climate change is a reality. But just to make sure we're all on the same page in reference to the formidability of the challenge that we're facing, I want to profile exactly what we're talking about when we talk about climate change and the challenge that's in front of us. Then I'm going to turn to climate change and extreme weather events that, to profile the degree to which they are very costly for the country. And costly, I'm talking about the financial costs being borne in particular by one industry sector, the area of property and casualty insurance, or home insurance, if you will. This is an industry that if any industry is on the forefront of addressing the challenges of climate change, it's the insurance sector. They're effectively, they're not the canary in the coal mine. They're the ostrich in the coal mine in terms of that being hit by climate change. And effectively, though, the challenge that industry is facing is a metaphor for the overall challenge that Canada and Canadians are facing. So I'm going to profile exactly what's going on in that industry by way of costs of climate change, extreme weather events. I then want to say a few words about where cities and businesses are in the country in reference to embracing adaptation to climate change. To what degree are we focusing on the fact that climate change is happening and we need to do something about it? And by the way, most of this addresses the challenges associated with too much water in the wrong place. When we talk about the challenges of climate change, we've got flooding challenges that you're well familiar with here in New Brunswick, but you can have ice loading, you can have wind, we can have fires. But the big monkey in the room, the big challenge in the country, disproportionately relative to all those other challenges, is water, too much water in the wrong place. So we're going to focus on flooding issues primarily. So I'll talk about where cities and businesses are in reference to addressing flooding or not having flooding as a means of exercise. And then I'm going to give you some practical examples of how we can adapt in the country to extreme weather events. There could be a much longer list here, but I'm going to focus on a few practical ways that we can take risk out of the system very cost effectively in reference primarily to flooding factors. I'm going to talk about the need to produce, amongst other initiatives, up-to-date floodplain maps in the country, maps that can show us where water is going to go when the big storms hit, that high intensity or duration rainfall events are, back to, as my wife said, just keep calling it big storms. I'm going to talk about the home adaptation assessment program that I'm deeply involved in Canada, and this is an initiative to focus on helping homeowners not realize a flooded basement. There's a way we can very much lower the probability of someone realizing a flooded basement in this country for very little effort, very little money, and I'm going to talk about that initiative. And then, excuse me, I'll say a few words about upgrades or needs to changes in the building codes, how we build stuff in this country so that it's better adapted to the changing climate that's coming. All of this is going to culminate in a conclusion of several points, but the key one is this, and indeed it's effectively the take-home message for tonight, and that is we must build a weather-ready nation right now. We need to build a weather-ready Canada now. Not 25 years from now, not 50 years from now, not 75 years from now. We have a formidable challenge on the table as of this moment, and we need to embrace adaptation currently. Excuse me. So, starting with the first question first, it's dangerous actually when you set the water near the electronic equipment. I did that a little while ago, which begs the question, why am I doing it again? And the water spilt, it went onto somebody's computer, and then the slides just started going crazy. But I'll keep it away from the equipment. Addressing the first question first, the state of the nation in reference to climate change, and what are we realizing? Well, the bottom line is this. Climate change, as I mentioned earlier, it has happened, is happening, and will continue to happen. And indeed, that's not some cavalier opinion on my part. This is the collective opinion, the collective wisdom of the group that produced this document. It was produced by a group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a collection of several hundred scientists that do nothing else 7 days a week other than study climate change and the causes thereof. And this group, this is the authoritative group in the world in reference to climate change and the causal mechanisms behind it. And what this group has concluded in this report, Climate Change 2013, the physical science basis, they concluded that yes, climate change is real, the temperature on the planet has gone up, and the activity of human beings, particularly through the burning of fossil fuels, is the causal mechanism. And indeed, here in quotes, I've taken this statement directly from the report, hence it's in quotes. They said the following. They said, it is extremely likely, which in the scientific world just never happens. The scientists don't agree on anything. So the fact they agree is amazing, particularly on a difficult topic. They said, it is extremely likely that the human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And indeed, from a climate change and increasing temperature perspective, the climate is up by about 0.08 degrees Celsius each decade over the last 100 years, or just slightly longer than that. We're up right now on the planet in terms of temperature 1 degree relative to where we were about 100 years ago. And for sure, it's human activity and the burning of fossil fuels on the planet that's driven that overall increase in temperature. Now, at first, when you hear that, you hear, well, we're up 1 degree Celsius. It doesn't sound all that bad or all that challenging. Indeed, I was saying to someone earlier that I was telling this to my next door neighbor a little while ago, that we're up 1 degree Celsius on the planet, and she goes, well, that sounds nice. And not realizing, though, that the difference in temperature on the planet today versus an ice age is about 6 to 7 degrees Celsius. So the difference between what we have now versus an ice age is 6 to 7 degrees Celsius. But over the period of the last 100 years, we've already forced the climate to go up 1 degree Celsius just through the burning of fossil fuels. So that's a pretty big deal when you see the manifestation of extreme weather in the forms of floods and increasing hail loads in locations, etc. Now, the expression of the increase in temperature is the extreme weather events, a few I'm going to show it in a few minutes. But knowing that it's the burning of fossil fuels on the planet that's driven the elevated temperature, and that's created a new normal in the weather to which we have to adapt today, we also have to think, if we're going to continue to burn fossil fuels on the planet, that should continue the process of change. And indeed, we're going to have an even more formidable weather in the future, extreme climate and extreme weather events in the future, to which we also want to be adapted. So if we're going to continue to burn fossil fuels on the planet, we have to forward project such that when we're building infrastructure today, for example, and we're building in a way that it's adapted to the new dynamics of potential for flooding that are occurring today in different locations or the amount of water that might be realized, when you're building a structure like this building that's going to be here for the next 25, 50, 75 years from now, you want to also make sure that you're building it in such a way that it's adapted to the future, to maybe there's not going to be water here now, but there might be 25 or 50 years down the road. So we have to think about adaptation on two scales if indeed we're going to continue to burn fossil fuels on the planet and the climate's going to change. Let's adapt to the current challenges, which is already formidable, but also we have to use models to forward project to what the weather's going to be like in the future and build that into our system. Because when you build a building like this, it effectively has zero capital stock turnover in human terms. It's here for the next, 50 to 100 years. Whereas my little BlackBerry here will be gone in a year from now. It's not a big problem. You could just update it as you go. Well, not for physical infrastructure. So the question is, are we going to continue to burn fossil fuels on the planet? That's the first question we have to think about relative to adaptation. And by the way, the first part of this lecture, there's about 3 or 4 slides here, it's actually quite depressing. And so I warn you now. But then I'll pick it up a little bit so that it's not so depressing when we talk about how do we adapt to this stuff. But everything I'm presenting, sometimes people think, wow, this sounds kind of doom and gloom and so forth. But the reality is I'm not making this stuff up. Like these are the cards that are on the table, and that's the way it is. So we deal with the situation and the challenge that we're facing head on. It's really a call to arms. So what you're looking at here in this chart, this is a graph from an organization called the International Energy Agency, the IEA. This is the foremost group on the planet that looks at energy generation mix, energy use on the planet on a global scale. And so they are the authoritative agency. And what they've done, they got together and they said, what does energy use on the planet look like today? And then they forward projected, in this case, to 2030. We're looking from 1980 over here to 2030. We're here at 2015, 2016, this vertical bar. They said, what does energy use on the planet look like today? And what will it look like in 2030? Let's forward project. And they used optimistic scenarios in reference to how energy conservation may mix into the system, the use of renewable, the utility of renewables in the system, wind and solar and so forth, and they factored that into this system. And what you can see is this, that right now, where we are at this moment in time on the planet, about 80, there's a little red dot here for those in the front, and for those in the back, hopefully you can see it. But anyhow, there's right now, about 80 or 81% of world energy supply at this moment comes from the use of about a third coal, oil, and natural gas. These are all fossil fuel-based sources of energy that when they're burnt to create energy, they give off greenhouse gas emissions that go into the atmosphere and they drive more and more of a changing climate. So right now on the planet, about 81% of world energy supply comes from about more or less a third coal, oil, and natural gas. And at the top here, we see the contribution of nuclear power, hydropower, biomass, and there's a little red wedge there that you can barely see. That's solar and wind power. So solar and wind on a global basis contribute almost nothing to world energy supply. And by the way, this is nothing against solar or wind or anything like that. I'm just saying this is the state of the nation. Now, they have forward projected to 2030 and said, what will energy use on the planet look like? And it turns out that there's a physicality of built-in infrastructure on the planet that makes it such that it's not easy to get off the current system we have and onto a new system. We've got a structure in place that you just can't turn around overnight. So what will happen in 2030, energy supply on the planet will still be more or less about 80% of world energy supply will come from a third coal, oil, and natural gas. But the collective footprint, the overall footprint, will be much greater than we're realizing today, because between where we are now and 2030, 2035 zone, we will add another 1.5 billion, with a B, new people to the planet. 1.5 billion new people will be on this planet that aren't here now by 2035. And to put that into perspective, currently there are 7.4 billion people on the planet. If you go back to the time of Christ, 0, there were about 250 million people on the planet. The planet was more or less empty. From the time of Christ to 1930, it took almost 2,000 years to put 2 billion people on the planet. In 1930, we hit 2 billion people, world population. From 1930 till now, we've added 5.4 billion people. Over a period of 86 years, we've added 2.5 times as many people to the planet. This is the depressing part. We've added 2.5 times as many people to the planet as what previously took 2,000 years. And between now and 2030-35, we will add almost as many new people to the planet as what previously took 2,000 years, long before half the people in this room are even close to being halfway to their retirement. The population on the planet right now increases net by more or less, it's just under, but more or less, by 11,000 people per hour. If you subtract deaths from births, every hour on the planet, there's 11,000 new people. That translates to 90 million new people per year, which is 1.5 billion people by 2035. And by the way, these new people coming onto the planet, no matter where they are now, it doesn't matter, you go to the Congo, you travel all around the world, they're all connected up electronically, more or less, or they have access to communication systems, and they aspire to a standard of living now that previously they may not know have existed. They want what we have. So we're going to have a lot more people on the planet building on what in terms of the numbers we currently have, aspiring to own a lot more, which is energy demanding. So that's a pretty formidable challenge. And indeed, when people talk about ways to address climate change through mitigation or adaptation, our focus here tonight is purely on adapting to climate change extreme weather events. But we should also address mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, do everything we can to lower the footprint of our operations as much as possible. That's the mitigation end of the equation, one of the things that we should really be thinking about in terms of mitigation also is family planning, birth control on a planet-wide basis. That's probably the number one thing we can engage to limit overall greenhouse gas emissions. Now, when I talk about those figures on population growth and it sounds formidable, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to see it. So what I'm showing here, this diagram shows the number of people on the planet, billions of people over here on this axis, and along the x-axis we have time. So this is the time of Christ here, and this is 2025. You can see, if you go back 2.5 million years when hominids, or people, basically showed up on the planet, for the vast majority of our existence, the planet was mostly empty. And at the time of, and then you can see where the Black Plague came in here, about 1350, about 100 million people were killed. That was a pretty big deal. It took about 30-40% of the people off the planet. But you can see we bounced back very quickly from that decline. But if you go to the time of Christ, here it's about 250 million people. You come over this little dinky short distance here, and we've gone from the time of Christ to 1930, brought us right here. This is 1930. If you can't see it, this is 1930, right here. And then between this little span of time, the world's population went from here off the top of the charts. So that's a pretty big challenge considering the fossil fuel mix we have on the planet. Now, what is the manifestation of the stress that we're realizing due to climate change, extreme weather events? What's the expression of it that we can numerically depict or financially depict? Well, probably the best set of data in that regard comes from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And what you're looking at here, this is data from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And on the x-axis, we start in the lower left-hand corner here, that's 1983, and we go over here to 2014. And now 2015, the bar that comes here, it virtually looks the same as 2014, but I just got that data, so I haven't added in. But there's another bar over here that, see this run? It's about here. And what you're looking at, what these orange or red, whatever color they are, what these bars show, these histograms show, they document the amount of money paid out in any given year by the property and casualty insurance sector in Canada, or if you're not familiar with the term, just say house insurance, for catastrophic loss claims. A claim in any given year that goes over $25 million paid out by the industry is called a catastrophic event. So when these events happen, the Insurance Bureau adds this stuff up for any given year, and they depict it as shown in this graph. And if you just look at the, I'll call them red bars, from 1983 over here to 2008, in any given year, on average, the property and casualty insurance sector in Canada for catastrophic loss claims could count on paying out money in this zone, about in the $200 to $500 million range. That's more or less what they counted on, they put on their books. However, you can see from 2009 onward, on a consistent basis, on an annual basis, the payouts have gone to over $1 billion per year on every single year. And in 2013, we went off the charts. We went up here to $3.4 billion claims payouts. And that was largely attributable to flood events that occurred in Toronto and Calgary that you'll remember well. If you put a regression line through this with an upward curve to it, you can see, what you see, there's the flat part of the curve here on this blue line. So we're in the zone of $200 to $500 million being paid out per year. Now, all of a sudden, the claims costs are tilting up very, very sharply. And again, the data for this year, for last year, is about in this zone, a little over $1 billion. This is very, very problematic to the property and casualty insurance sector, which also means you as a homeowner, because for 9 of the last 11 years in Canada, the money that's come into the area of property and casualty insurance through premiums has been less than the money going out the door through claims. The industry has less money coming in than has been going out the door through claims for 9 of the last 11 years. And by the way, the factor driving, and all this data, by the way, is corrected for 2012 dollars. It's all normalized to 2012. And the factor that is explaining most of this output, most of these claims, it's water flooding. About 55 to 60% of all the claims that are realized in the country through property casualty insurance, it's due to water and flooding. That's not to say that certain problems aren't highly problematic in some zones. For example, in southern Alberta now, the insurance sector used to be able to count on 2 or 3 major hail events per season, per year, affecting damage to automobiles. Now, on a regular basis, they're getting 10 to 12 major hail events on an annual basis. That's very, very problematic and costly in terms of auto insurance. And indeed, the industry, working with organizations like Purelator is now, wherever possible, parking their trucks undercover at night or during the day, whenever possible, to put them out of harm's way relative to hail impacts. So that's an aspect of adaptation applied to that industry. So what's happened here, and the next manifestation of this, is what's now showing up in Canada is in communities from east to west coast, north to south, and I see a lot of this, I travel a great deal. I'm actually the guy causing the greenhouse gas emissions, but that's a different story. We now have the realization of an uninsurable housing market showing up in lots of communities across Canada. Because when a person's insurance contract comes up for renewal, in many localities, the threat of flooding and basement flooding is so great in certain communities, the primary insurers are saying, we're no longer going to offer insurance in this particular community. Even if you haven't made a claim, you may be in an area where others have, or it's deemed to be highly, highly risky. And so in Canada, there are about 15 insurance companies, big insurance companies, that cover about 65 of the underwriting in the country. There are about 275 insurance companies in the country as a whole, but 15 of them control about 65% of the market. So now many of these big insurers in discrete localities within communities across the country, they're walking away from certain markets. This is highly problematic to you if you're a homeowner, because now when your insurance comes up for renewal and you can't get one of the primary insurers to insure you, you start going down to the list into a very sketchy zone of quite frankly, secondary and tertiary lenders, which in some cases is just fractionally above dealing with the mafia in reference to getting host insurance. This is problematic. This is devaluing homes, because if you've got a home that's effectively uninsurable, it's difficult to sell, or there's a problem with the mortgage market, because to get a mortgage, you need house insurance. And part of the package of house insurance, they very much look at the house from the context of, if it's so risky, it's going to have a flooded basement, we just don't want to offer insurance on this house, period. And so now, as challenging as that sounds, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to see it. So this is what this stuff looks like in action. I took this picture. And this is from a community at the north end of Toronto that is now largely has houses that are uninsurable, certainly by any of the standard insurers, or the premiums are off the charts for the vast, vast majority of people. And what you're looking at here, I'm standing on the porch of a house that looks like these, just opposite corner, and this is a flood that occurred in 2013. And indeed, this is when the water was residing. A little bit earlier, the water was right up to the foundations of each one of these houses, about a foot up on the porches here. Literally, these houses were islands in the middle of a lake. And this flooding, as you see here, happened 3 times in this community in 2013 alone. They went through this 3 times. So and what's interesting about it is that these aren't people. If you went to that community right now and drove through there, you don't see any running water. There are no streams, no creeks, no rivers, nothing, no flowing water. You say, well, how can this happen? In other words, these aren't people that build a house on the side of the Bow River and then the thing flooded, and you look at them and you think, well, what did you think was going to happen, right? So what happens here is there's actually, in this particular community, if you know Toronto, if you're unfortunate enough to be in that situation, everybody loves it when you make fun of Toronto once you're outside Toronto. So but if you know, this is an area at the north end of Toronto. It's south of Downsview Airport and north of the 401 in the Yorkdale shopping mall area, if you happen to know it, and if you don't, it doesn't really matter. But so there's several hundred homes here. There's a confluence of 3 major storm sewer lines that come down into that region from further north. And when the big storms hit, the high intensity duration rainfall events hit, the water travels through that sewer system and then bubbles up, as you see here. This is water coming into the region driven through the storm sewer system. This is called pluvial flooding. It's urban flooding. It's flooding caused by the infrastructure. versus fluvial flooding, which is rivers overflowing their banks. And by the way, for flooding of this nature, where the water comes up and goes through the side window of the house and into the basement, there is no insurance coverage for that. In other words, when you get a flooded basement, the water can come into the basement effectively two ways. It can come up through the sewer system when it's overwhelmed. It can come up through the little drain in the basement that's there for when your dishwasher overflows or washing machine overflows. You have a little drain in the basement, the water flows out. During really big storms, depending on how the trunk lines hook up for the sanitary and the storm sewers, the system can become overwhelmed, water back up through that system, and in the insurance industry it's creatively called sewer backup flooding. It comes through the drain in the basement, floods out the basement. For that type of flooding, you can buy insurance coverage. And the costs associated with that are reflected on the previous graph, that chart with the big payouts. But if the local stream overflowed, or in this case, for whatever reason, water flowed through the side window of the house, that's called overland flooding. And for that type of flooding, there has been no insurance coverage in Canada, historically, none. It's only in the last year that a few insurers are starting to provide overland flood insurance, but at a premium. You pay for it, but at least it's available. So this is also very problematic, not just financially, but even psychologically to people, because you can have a person who's owned a house for 25 years, been paying premiums for 25 years, never made a claim. All of a sudden, one of these big micro storms comes through, puts down a lot of water in a big hurry, floods a basement. The homeowner calls up their insurance provider and says, I got a problem, can you send someone out? The adjuster comes out, walks into the basement and says, you've got 3 feet of water there, and they walk in the basement, look, and they go, I'm sorry, the water came in through the window, you're not covered, period. And that's what people were finding out in mass now over the last 5 or 10 years in Canada. About 75% of people in Canada thought they were covered for overland flood insurance. As a matter of fact, they didn't even know there was a difference between sewer backup and overland. And this is very devastating to people when they're stressed beyond belief, even if they were covered, and now they find out I'm not covered. So this is the formidability of one of the challenges we're facing from extreme weather. And now, in reference to the uninsurability of the housing market, again, there's lots of cities of towns I'm talking with now about ways to de-risk them relative to these events. But in reference to the uninsurability of them, I just picked out this article that was in the paper somebody sent to me about 2 weeks ago. It references London, Ontario, which is, if you know Ontario, it's a fair size, it's a city, probably I would think the size of Fredericton, I'm not quite sure. But anyhow, a couple hours west of Toronto. And I don't expect you to read this, by the way. But there's one point here I am going to read. So it's about London, Ontario right now. They've got lots of pockets showing up in the city where the insurers are no longer providing insurance. So, but I'm not picking on London. I could put a whole slew of cities up here from across the country. But just to illustrate, this is a city councillor talking. I'm reading just this paragraph here. It says, serious flooding has happened more than once on some properties, and there are people who can't get insurance. Committee Chair Jesse Helmer told Thompson's, this is a local newspaper. If we can improve their risk profile, maybe they can get insurance. So later on, when I talk about the home adaptation assessment program, that's kind of what we're working towards, at least one way to help them to get back into the insurable world. Now, I want to switch topics a little bit from that's the challenge, painting the picture of the challenge. I'm hitting something. I don't know what I'm hitting, but anyway, I'm hitting something. I want to focus now on just where is Canada in reference to the preparedness of the largest cities in Canada to deal with flood. And indeed, I was involved in a program, I ran a program, for which a report was written more or less about 6 months ago that drew a tremendous amount of attention in the media, where we focused on the state of flood preparedness of Canada's largest 15 cities. So this went from east to west in the country, and the largest 15 cities, probably everybody here could name them. So the purpose of the analysis was this. I'll just read it and then say a few words. To assess the preparedness of 15 major Canadian cities to limit potential flood damage relative to current, the year we did it was last year, 2015, and anticipated future, 2030, high intensity and duration precipitation events. In other words, big storms. So are they prepared for the big storms that are here now? And are they forward projecting to the even bigger storms that are coming for sure in the future based on everything we just saw? And what we did in reference to examining the state of preparedness of these cities, we said, how prepared are they relative to, in this case, 16 measures of performance, and they're shown here. And I won't describe them all, but for example, one of the things we looked at for the 15 cities is, are they producing up-to-date floodplain maps? Do they have floodplain maps in cities that can tell them where the water is going to go when the big storms hit today? And they could use that as guidance for example, to say, well, we're not going to build a subdivision over there, or we're not going to put a shopping mall there because we've updated the floodplain maps. We know that place is going to flood out, so let's use the floodplain map to give us guidance to not build there. Or it may be that the floodplain maps that they've developed for today don't show a problem, but those that make projections for 15, 20 years down the road say, it is going to be problematic in the future, therefore we don't want to build there. So, the same with land use planning. Even if they have the floodplain maps, are they actually using them to give in the form of guidance to avoid those areas through the scenario I just described? And I won't go through all of these factors, but for every one of these, and it would be too much detail for tonight, we had a way to quantify the performance of the city based on a lot of interviews in the city. We did about 75 interviews for this with an average of 5 people per city and about 3 or 4 interviews going back to the same five people 3 or 4 times so that it could seek out the information we needed to calculate the degree to which they were prepared on certain fronts. We talked to anybody in the city, almost anybody that had the word chief in front of their name. Chief investment officer, chief risk officer, chief environmental officer, chief administrative officer, people like that, people who knew what was going on in the city. We said, how prepared are you for all these factors? And we could quantify performance on every one of the 16 from, at the very bottom of the scale, they're doing nothing and it's not on their radar screen. Well, then they would get a score of 0, or we called it an E, because we ultimately put it into a report card like a kid would have in high school. And then if they had done a lot of work on that issue, they had recognized it, they had people in charge of it, they had a budget attached to it, they had a process of continuous improvement in place in reference to ensuring they remain up to date on the issue, they were at the top of the scale, they got an A. And then we had gradations in between that could tell us, do they get an A, B, C, D, or E? So that's more or less it. I could show you a whole bunch of slides, but that's what they would amount to. So we could quantify the performance. And on this side of the equation over here on the slide, we were basically looking at factors that seem fairly obvious in terms of things you would look at from a preparedness perspective. It seems sort of obvious that probably you look at floodplain mapping. You want to know where the water is going to go when the big storms hit. That seems like a starting point. You want to embrace land use planning. You want to have a program in place in urban drainage maintenance. In other words, you've got culverts to drain water out of certain areas of the cities. Do you have programs in place to make sure that they're not all covered with debris when the big storms hit so that the water can't get through it and it causes flooding, that kind of thing. On the factors in terms of housing, is there a mandate in place to put a backwater valve in place in the drain in the basement? Remember when I talked about water coming up through the drain in the basement when the system is overloaded by a big storm? Well, there's a little valve that you can put in that system that at the time of building a new house, it costs about $275. It can make it such that water can go out of the basement, but it can't come back in through the system. It can only flow one way. And at the time you're building a house, to put one of these things in place called a backwater valve, it costs about $275. If you retrofit, if you put one in place, you've got a basement built, the drainage is there, but you don't have a valve in place, but you think, you know what, I think I'm going to have problems here pertaining to flooding, or I have had problems pertaining to flooding. You can put one of these things in for somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 usually, retrofit costs with a plumber. So these are the factors that on this side of the equation kind of make sense for a city to look at, but we also looked at, do they have programs in place to maintain the continuity of electricity supply when the big storms hit? Fuel supply or petroleum supply? Will the transportation systems work? Will the telecommunication systems work? When the big storms hit, one of the things you find is all of a sudden nobody can communicate. So has the city, are they working with organizations like Shaw, Rogers, Bell, Cogeco, etc., to say, you know, we want to make sure we've got a system in place when the big storms hit, we can all communicate. That, and it sounds obvious, but I tell you, these things happen, and all of a sudden the first thing goes, everybody says, nothing works, we can't communicate. Retail food supply. You've got a family over here, they've got some kids at home, and all of a sudden none of the stores are open and they can't get food, and they've got a 3-month-old baby at home. Banking, financial services. You go to an automatic banking, ABM, automatic banking, banking machine, whatever it's called. When you go there, can you get money out of these things? So we looked at these factors that you tend to not think about so much. We quantified this performance, and what we found was this. Now this thing looks kind of formidable, but what you're looking at is this. Just look at, for this wagon wheel, just to look at one factor. And this is the score for the city of Ottawa. And it turned out, by the way, for the 15 cities we examined, and we were totally agnostic. We had no idea who's going to score high, low, or anything else. It turned out that Ottawa was the best prepared city in Canada in reference to preparedness for flooding, which is probably the opposite of what everybody would think. But anyhow, and what you're looking at here, the orange bars, forget the blue, just the orange slices of the pie here, these orange wedges, they show the average scores of all 15 cities rolled into one. So that's the benchmark for Canada. And then the blue scores are the scores, in this case, for Ottawa. And then we had other wagon wheels that looked like this for different cities. But what you can see, if you just look at the orange bars, you can see the average scores for city in Canada, they were pretty good. They got a B for floodplain mapping. They got a B for land use planning. They're in the B zone for urban drainage. Not too bad. Back here on backwater valve installation that I just described for new houses, the average score in Canada was a B. But where you see things start to break down is when you get over here into electricity supply, the average score was a C. Here it's fuel supply or petroleum, a C. Transportation, a little bit better, a B. Retail food supply, a C. Financial services, a C. Water and wastewater supply, they did a little bit better. But the point is, what's happening in the cities currently is the things that are reasonably obvious that they should focus on, they're actually doing a pretty good job, not a bad job. Some cities better than others. But then there's other areas that they're not considering. And it's very interesting. And believe me, when this stuff came out, I got calls from 15 mayors in very short order. And it turned out that for those cities that scored in the top 2/3, they thought this study was really good and they appreciate it. And indeed, if they're at the top of the list, they thought it was absolutely brilliant. There are a few cities at the bottom that they didn't think our design was all that intelligent. But anyhow, it worked out well because then you end up working with them. But what happened is, by and large, let's say we picked telecommunications, just to illustrate one point here of advice to a lot of mayors, and they got this, and councillors. They would look at it, and I understand their point. They would say, listen, telecommunications, that's not our direct line of responsibility. That's Rogers, that's Cogeco, that's Shaw, that's Bell Canada. And I said, correct, it's not your direct line of responsibility. However, you as a mayor and councillors, you're still charged with the task of maintaining a functioning city. So when the big floods hit, first of all, the people are going to go to you, stop number one, to blame you as the mayor and councillors to say, why can't we communicate? And my suggestion to them was, yeah, it's not your direct line responsibility, but there is a dotted line responsibility to it. And if you contact the heads of the major communications companies, you go to the presidents of Rogers, Bell, Cogeco, and whatever, they will send the right people to a meeting that you can lead and facilitate to say, look, we want to work with you as a city, and you're the communicators, to ensure that we maintain the integrity of communications, the integrity of electricity supply with the electricity suppliers, transportation systems, financial systems, and that they got. So now more cities are doing work in that area. And I'll say a few brief words about where the business community is in Canada in reference to, I don't know how I'm literally not touching things. This guy here?
Yes.
Okay, now? Yes. You still hear me?
Say pizza.
Say pizza?
Yeah.
Good.
You're good.
Oh, well, how come you didn't say that earlier? I'm just kidding. See, this is now I'm a politician, I'm going to blame someone else. But I am. No, I'm only joking. So I want to say a few words about where business is, the industry sector is on adaptation and climate change. And indeed, I'm going to say a few more extra words, perhaps, in reference to electricity, ultimately electricity supply, generation, transmission, and distribution. For the last 10 years or so, or something like that, I've been very active with the Canadian Electricity Association in reference to, for a period of quite a few years, chairing a program with the Canadian Electricity Association, which basically encapsulates 90% of the electricity supply in Canada. I've been deeply involved in a program there, and indeed started it, to be honest, called the Sustainable Electricity Program. And it's looking at how do we bring best practices to the electricity world from an environmental, economic, social best practices perspective. One aspect that we are focusing on is adaptation to climate change. And what we're realizing is that given the challenge that I've described early on, which the industry is realizing is problematic for electricity supply, generating electricity, transmission, the big giant lines you see that move electricity over large distances, and then distribution, the local lines that bring electricity into the city. From each of those three perspectives, how well prepared are we to ensure the integrity of electricity supply across generation, transmission, distribution? And to avoid, so that when problems like you see in the lower left-hand corner here occur, or up here occur, when those challenges occur, that we don't end up in these situations. And basically where we are right now is that we recognize quite well what the challenge of the situation is, and to greater or lesser extents we're trying to identify what are the key challenges we're facing. If you had to put a short list together of 5 to 10 things that are particularly formidable for this sector that make it vulnerable to climate change and extreme weather events, what are they, and what can we do when we build new or through scheduled retrofits to take risk out of the system? And for this industry, it's particularly important because between now and 2035 in Canada, we have to spend in this country between 300 and 350 billion with a B new dollars to rebuild electricity generation, transmission, and distribution. Effectively, between now and 2035, to a very large extent, we have to rebuild a big proportion of the electricity system in Canada. And what we want to make sure is that we build it right under the umbrella of adaptation to climate change versus building it wrong. So if you have a utility center or a substation like you see in the lower left-hand corner here, obviously this is flooded out, where we're building these things, large and small, do we continue to build them at grade on a cement platform that's at grade or at ground level such that when the big storms hit, they all go underwater? Or should it be we produce up-to-date floodplain maps and don't put this thing in that location? There's one. Or number two, when we build these things, do we build them on a 2-meter high concrete platform so that they're out of harm's way when the water hits? They're not all sunk. And at the time that you're building a facility like this, to build it on a 2-meter high platform costs more or less the same as to build it on a cement platform at grade. Therefore, why not build it right versus build it wrong? And this addresses a key point, or that one example is effectively a metaphor for a key point. And it is that it is a misnomer in the country that people think that adaptation to climate change is always expensive. And indeed, the first discussions I had with Kathleen Wynne, the Premier in Ontario on this topic, she started out with, well, it's so expensive, how can we do it? But when you start to give her a whole bunch of examples, she goes, okay, I get it, you know. So the cost of building it right is more or less the cost of building it wrong. It's the same, if you're building this room, this auditorium, at the time you're building it, it costs more or less the same to build a sprinkler system into this system, to retard fire in the case of fire breaks out. It costs more, when you're building it, it costs not a lot more to put the plumbing in place to put a sprinkler system in. But if you build it wrong, i.e. without the sprinkler system in place, and then a few years later decide, oh, we need that, you have to tear this whole place apart to put it, oh, see, you're a bum. You have to tear this whole place apart to correct it, and it costs half the price of the facility all over again. So when you're building new, or you have a scheduled retrofit, it basically costs the same to build it right as build it wrong. So that's where we are in the electricity sector. We know what the challenge is, and we're doing a lot of work right now to figure out how do we build it right going forward. But that industry is in the same ballpark as if you talk about the transportation sector. They're looking at for rail lines. How do we build them right versus wrong to ensure they're going to withstand the assault of climate change extreme weather events? These are rail cars that are just hanging precariously over the Bow River during the 2013 floods in Calgary. And at the time, nobody even knew what was in these rail cars. And that could have ended up in the water. It didn't, just by luck. In the mining sphere, water loading in mining areas, very problematic because we're getting storms that are bigger than what tailings walls were designed for in reference to holding water back. And indeed, through Canada's north, and I don't think anybody has an exact number on this, We have lots and lots of tailings areas. These are areas where the waste product from a mining operation goes, and you store it there, and you build a great big wall to hold it in place. Well, in the far north, we're very dependent in many cases on permafrost being in the ground to maintain the integrity of those retaining walls. Well, in the far north, the north is now warming a lot through climate change, and the frost is coming out of the ground. And mark my words, between now and 5 years from now, you're going to start hearing about tailings walls collapsing, causing ecological catastrophes on the Arctic landscape through the fact that these walls come down. Forestry sector, very problematic in terms of not just water, but insects past that. Now that sometimes it's not getting cold enough in the winter, and there's certain types of beetles and so forth that now make it through the winter, and they can cause devastating impacts in terms of killing various species of pine. Commercial real estate, this is downtown Canmore during the 2013 floods. From a commercial real estate perspective, flooding is very, very problematic, as you might guess. And indeed, I'm up to here working with the commercial real estate sector to say, not only do we want to figure out how to build your large buildings such that they're not subject or vulnerable to extreme weather events and flooding, i.e. you don't have the electricity vaults and the communication vaults in the basement, or if you do, they're completely and totally flood-proofed. But we also want to work with local municipalities to say, it's one thing if you're Bentel Kennedy or Oxford Properties or Cadillac Fairview or Brookfield, whoever it is, you've sort of brought your building up to speed in reference to avoiding flooding. You also want to make sure that you're not in a downtown core that's still going to go under 3 feet of water. So you want to work with the municipality to say, what can we do together? You want the insurer to come to the table, the CFO of the building does, or the enterprise wants the insurer to come to the table and say, look, if you do this and lower your risk profile, we'll give you a risk-adjusted insurance premium, a lower deductible, a higher cap limit. So part of my job is bringing the right players together on this front. Now finally, just on a few points here about what can we do from an adaptation perspective. And I've talked a little bit about floodplains here and there, I've mentioned them. A little while ago, I went and interviewed the presidents and CEOs of the largest 15 property and casualty insurance companies in Canada, and I said to them, under the condition where we are now, which is we don't offer overland flood insurance, remember the water that comes through the side window of the house in the basement, we didn't offer that. I said to them, if you were to offer overland flood insurance, and I'm not saying you will, but I'm saying if you were to offer it, what conditions would have to be met? Because it's a risky proposition. They're already losing money on sewer backup, so they're not really anxious to put out overland flood insurance, which might be an even bigger money loser. So I said to them, but they also realize if they do nothing, they might be regulated to do so. So they're not dumb. You can't ignore it either. So one of the questions I asked them was this, in reference to the floodplain maps. Do we know enough about the floodplain maps to even offer overland flood insurance? So I presented them collectively, all 15, with this statement. I said, is floodplain mapping sufficiently understood in the regions identified that underwriting or risk exposure due to flooding can be adequately calculated? Yes, no, don't know. And in the areas of Eastern Canada, Central Canada, Western Canada, and Northern Canada, the answers were overwhelming: no, 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 and no. They have no faith in the floodplain maps as they currently exist in Canada. By and large, with a few exceptions here and there, the floodplain maps in Canada are totally out of date relative to the big storms that are occurring today, never mind the ones that will occur 15 to 25 years down the road. So one of the things we have to do from an adaptation perspective that is a non-negotiable is build new up-to-date floodplain maps. A few words here about the home adaptation assessment program that I'm quite involved in. And indeed, this is a program right now that we're deploying at the level of, we've done test trials of several hundred homes to begin with. Now we're deploying it at the level of a city, and we want to go from the level of a city to actually roll it out to a province and then to the level of Canada. That's sort of the plan. And it's a little bit parallel to the home energy audit program you're familiar with. Somebody comes into your house and looks at caulking around your windows and more insulation in the attic and a more efficient furnace and those types of things. How can you make your home more energy efficient? Well, this is parallel to that, but it's how do we make your home more resistant to the potential for basement flooding? So, the home adaptation assessment program. What is it? It limits the potential for basement flooding. because that's the big elephant in the room that's very, very expensive. So we zero in. The technical aspects of an assessment, or sometimes you call it an audit, but I found audit is scary to people. If you say we're going to come in and audit your house, they get scared. If you say we're going to come in and do an assessment, it sounds very friendly, right? Doesn't sound as formidable, so you got to call it the right thing. So we're going to assessment versus audit. And that was somebody's master's degree to use the word assessment versus audit. But anyhow, but they proved it. So how does it work? Somebody comes out to your house. To do my house, it took about 2 hours. A person comes out to your house to do an assessment. It takes about 1.5 to 2.5 hours. One assessor can do 2 or 3 audits per day. And even forgetting this stuff for a second, what they do, they come to your house and they walk around with the homeowner. And over the period of about 2 hours, they look at more or less 40 or 50 points of reference around a house, the outside and inside, that on the outside could be potential entryways whereby water could enter into a house. Or inside the house, they look at if water does get in, how do we lower the probability that it's going to cause a lot of damage? So the 40 or 50 points of reference outside the house to limit potential damage, they may look at things like, for example, disconnecting downspouts. So where the downspout comes off the eaves trough, disconnecting it from going into the weeping tile system and potentially into the basement, cut it off, put an elbow on it, and direct the water 3 meters away from the foundation of the house. Very simple to do. Contouring to direct water away from the foundation of the house. Houses are heavy. They sink over time. And very often you can have water flowing towards the foundation versus away from it. So contouring to get the water to flow away versus towards it. Plastic covers over window wells. Make it such that you put a plastic cover over a window well, so when the big storms hit, the light can still get into the basement, but it hits the window well, the plastic cover, and it can't enter the window well and subsequently flood out the basement. Do you have a battery backup? If water does get in the basement, do you have a battery backup for the sub pump? Because the time very often you need a sub pump to get water out of a basement, it's when the big storms are hitting, and when the big storms are hitting, that's when the electricity goes out quite often. So you want to make sure, do you have a battery backup supply such that the time you need the sub pump, it works? And now I just put a few obvious things here, but I can tell you when the assessor comes to your home and they start looking at these 40 or 50 points, there's probably not any one of these points that you wouldn't look at and go, yeah, I understand that. But on your own, you would never think of all these things. I thought I understood it pretty well until I got more into it. And I thought, holy cow, like there's a lot of things you can do to de-risk very, very easily for very little effort in reference to not having a basement flood. And what we found, based on running about 400 of these assessments in Calgary, Waterloo, and Kitchener, is that 63%, more or less 2/3 of homeowners that had the assessment, they had acted upon 75% of the recommendations, the Home Adaptation Assessment Program recommendations, within a 6 to 8 week period, within about 2 months. And this was voluntary. So for the average homeowner, there's about 6 to 8 recommendations that usually come out of the assessment that give you ideas, this is what you can do to de-risk your property. The 2/3 of the people had operationalized 3/4 of these recommendations within a 2-month period voluntarily. And the reason I think it worked, and we had no idea what would be the uptake. You don't know if nobody's going to do it or everybody's going to do it or somewhere in between. The uptake was pretty good. And you know why? It's a little bit why, at least this is my opinion, it's like this. It's the same reason the Blue Box program works. Because there's not much effort required, you're not giving up lifestyle. In other words, if I'm going to put garbage out at my curb, it's not a big deal to me, quite frankly, if I walk out with a blue box with stuff sorted or conventional green garbage container. For the home assessment program, people, if they have experienced flooding, they sure don't want to go through it twice. So if you can say to them, look, you can operationalize these recommendations usually on a Saturday and maybe a Sunday morning. Usually the homeowner, him or herself, they can do it. It doesn't take special expertise. You can operationalize it on a weekend yourself for very little money along the lines of what I'm talking about. And that's the difference, let's say, being on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 being the best, 100 being the worst for a basement flood. It can take you from an 80 down to a 30 just by working for a day and a half on the weekend and spending next to no money. They go, that's a pretty good deal. Because for most people, the equity they have in life, their biggest investment is their home. And if you say, for this little bit of effort, you can not experience a basement flood, it's pretty good. And by the way, independent of all the financial stress that goes with a basement flood, putting that aside, It's a god-awful thing to go through, a basement flood, even if you do have insurance coverage. It's not a place you want to be. So that's why I think we're having such substantial uptake. And by the way, what we're looking at now, though, down the road, we're going to link this, though, to a risk-adjusted insurance premium, lower deductible, higher cap limit. And also, you know, when you buy a house and you look at the listing for a house, the property, and it's got a million boxes there with a bunch of stuff filled out of characteristics of the house, it's UFI, like you have this, you know, particular type of insulation that you don't want. It says no. It talks about the tax base and whatever. I want to get a box on there that says HAP, Y or N. Have you had it or have you not had it? Another thing we can do, just in reference to a building code, update the building code so that it becomes mandatory. This is the little magical backwater valve I was talking about earlier that you can put on the drain in the basement. At the time you're building a house, you put one of these things in place. It's about $275. It costs the same as the amount of money that you would spend to change the color of the knobs on the kitchen counters, right? And basically it's the difference very much, they're almost foolproof now. Now they used to have flappers, now they have floating ball, you know, they probably took some engineer, that's 10 PhDs to do that. But anyhow, they put a floating ball in it and that virtually works 100% now to not have water come up through the system. For $275 on a house that, let's say you're building a house, it doesn't matter whether it's $200,000 or $2 million, it basically doesn't change the price of the house. So why not put it in? And in areas where they're flood vulnerable during the floodplain maps, put them in as a retrofit. So, conclusions. What do we conclude? A few points. Climate change and severe weather will get worse. The big floods are yet to come. Guaranteed, Canada has not experienced flooding yet relative to what is coming. And indeed, when I talked to the president and CEOs of the major insurance companies, I said to them, what keeps you up at night? What really worries you? They said, you know, as bad as the Calgary floods were, $3.4 billion, and the Toronto floods, and then floods that are going across some places all across the country, what they worry about is what happens when the $25 billion flood hits and wipes out the Fraser Valley, or takes the city of Kingston off the map, or Edmundston, or whatever it might be. That's what really worries these guys. And by the way, even the dollar costs that I've been referencing, those were all insurable losses. For every dollar in insurable loss in the country, we have $3 to $4 of uninsurable losses. So every dollar I've mentioned here, multiply that by 3 or 4, and that's how much the cost is being realized in the country that's non-insurable. Which, by the way, all comes back to the homeowner. It doesn't matter if it's insurable or non-insurable. There's only one payer in the system. If your insurance company pays, it means you've paid into them through a premium, so it's your money. If through disaster relief assistance from the federal government to the province to the homeowner, when big giant catastrophes occur, that money still started at the homeowner. The government's not secretly printing money, well, I hope they're not, secretly printing money in a basement somewhere. It still started with the homeowner. Like, it's your money. It just came back to you through a circuitous pathway. Or if you've got a big giant tin can in the backyard filled with water, probably waterlogged, but anyhow, that's your money. No matter what, it starts with the person. So we've got to get the risk out of the system. Bottom line is, not adapting is not an option. The costs of not acting far exceed those of acting. Far, far better to take the bull by the horns and lead them be led, and the money savings will be there. And for work that's been done in Canada, Australia, and other places, more or less it works out that for every $1 you spend on adaptation, you realize between about $6 and $12 return in investment relative to avoided losses, catastrophes that didn't occur. We must avoid management by disaster scenarios, and that's kind of where we are right now very often. People, when something really, really bad happens, that's when everybody gets interested and they all try to solve the problem, but we're doing it post hoc. In other words, we're not getting ahead of the curve. We've got to get ahead of the curve on these files. And it's amazing too, the window of opportunity where if the attention of the public is very short. Now in Calgary, they're in a position now where even councillors in areas that were devastatedly flooded, had devastating floods, and where they've produced up-to-date floodplain maps, now they've got people arguing that they should be able to rebuild there. Because they say, these are 1 in 100-year storms, and we just had ours. So we're good now for 98 years. So we've even got to change the language we're using to explain to people what a 1 in 100-year storm means. That doesn't mean it's on a schedule, right? The time to act is now. Adaptation applied to infrastructure will only be available for the next few years, and then fixing the extreme weather challenge will not be possible. Every day that we don't adapt and build adaptation into the physicality of infrastructure or retaining natural wetlands, that's natural infrastructure, is a day we don't have. We're building maladapted, probably, infrastructure. So we've got to get on with it now. And if we don't do it now, and you certainly see with the budget that came down here yesterday in the province, that scenario is repeated for provinces all right across the country and the federal government. They're all out of money. So quite frankly, we've got to spend money very, very wisely now so that we don't spend even more down the road, because there's not a lot of excess cash floating around. And indeed, here, I'll bring it back to Toronto for a second. Like, here's something, if you look at Toronto traffic, which, by the way, if you're going to Toronto, don't go. Toronto is effectively incapacitated as a city due to traffic. You cannot get around. It takes, every meeting I go to that 30 years ago would have taken, I would have allowed 35 minutes to get there. You now have to plan on between 2.5 hours. I live in Oakville, which is just on the outsides of Toronto, and if I'm going to a meeting downtown for 1 hour at 11 o'clock, that basically takes off 3/4 of the day, the 1 hour meeting, to get there through traffic. It's even problematic to get to a subway. It takes an hour to get to a subway. Never mind get on the subway and get downtown, which is another hour. The point is, the powers to be that have been there for the last 35, 40 years or whatever, 50 years, whatever it is, they never addressed the problem of traffic, and now it can't be solved. The structure is such that you just can't solve it. You can tweak it a little bit here and there, but you can't solve it. So what I'm saying is there's a parallel here. It's let's not be dumb. Let's get ahead of the curve on adaptation. So the take-home message is this: we must build a weather-ready nation. That is non-negotiable. Thank you very much.
I teach climate change here at STU, and so, and hope there's some students here of mine. But anyway, so I have a couple of questions. One has to do with the federal infrastructure program, which Justin Trudeau has promised and it will roll out soon. So have you been talking to them about criteria for that kind of spending? And is it built into the criteria? How ready are municipalities and provinces to actually fulfill that kind of criteria for possible infrastructure projects? That's my first question.
So, okay. You guys do hear buzzing, right? That's not just me, right? Okay. Is this still, it does matter. I'll just talk real loud. Well, in reference to the first part with the Prime Minister's office, and I know those guys fairly well, and the new Minister of the Environment at the federal level. So I spent maybe 3 hours on the phone with them last week, for example. And what they're looking at, I can tell you, is they've made a commitment to make some substantive announcements on climate change be in their first 90 days of office. And then they made the similar announcements over at COP21. So what they were worried about, and I understand, I appreciate it, it's a new government, they're still kind of trying to find their legs, but they wanted to be able to make an announcement that was more than we're going to have meetings on a regular basis and we're going to further commit to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but they wanted something, what can they announce that's solid? So what I spent quite a bit of time with them on was the adaptation end of the equation. Mostly their discussions to date on addressing climate change have almost at the 90% mark been on the mitigation end of the equation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is a good thing to do, with very little emphasis on adaptation to climate change. So I brought them very much into the camp of adaptation and said, for example, through the Home Adaptation Assessment Program, this is something that works. There are no political minefields associated with it. Everybody likes it. Homeowners like it, mayors like it, premiers like it, everybody likes it. It works. It's a solid. So they're looking for solid deliverables or announcements that they can come up with. The Prime Minister, he's going to be at, there's a big environmental meeting in Vancouver in a few weeks, about a month from now, called Globe 2016. He's running a meeting parallel to that. They would like to have some solid announcements at that, and this, I'm hoping this will be one of them. So, but what you find overall, basically, if you take 3 levels of government, federal government, provincial government, municipal governments, And just looking at the adaptation end of the equation, the federal government is very light on adaptation. The provincial governments are more engaged, but not off the charts. And municipal governments, mayors, councillors, are very much engaged on the adaptation end of the equation, because I think it's because they're seeing it up close in their constituency. The big floods hit, the mayor gets in the car, drives over there, all these people are flooded out or whatever the problem is, and it is very, very real. So my view is the real leadership on the file is coming disproportionately at the municipal level, secondarily, provincially, and at thirdly, federally. But I think there's pretty smart people in Ottawa on this file. Marlo Reynolds, who's the chief of staff to Catherine McKenna, the new Minister of Environment. Marlo's been around this file for a long, long time. He knows it very, very well, and I think they're getting good advice internally, and they know who to speak to externally to advance the file.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I don't know who's in charge of infrastructure, of the infrastructure program, but it's probably not Catherine McKenna.
No, it's...
Yeah, so anyway, so that's what, your point about spending money right instead of wrong,
yeah.
I think is very germane to this infrastructure program, and I worry about lots of money flowing out quickly in the name of job creation, and not doing what you're suggesting. My second question, if I may, is there anybody else in line? My second question has to do with public insurance. So New Brunswick, so I'm not sure the averages, but perhaps we're up into the last few years, probably around $50 million a year being spent on disaster relief from floods and storms. So
the province itself.
The province, yeah, paying out, for uninsured damages. So $50 million is a lot of money, as we know from the recent budget talks. But nobody's ever talking about that. Nobody is suggesting maybe we should do something. And I guess what I'm wondering is if you have thought about, or anybody you know thought about, the idea of the government actually setting up a public insurance program for climate change damages, into which, people would pay, but the government would also, the government would be the insurer. Because this sort of check writing on a year-by-year basis that is really unaccounted for and not budgeted for in any kind of, how do you know, right?
Yeah.
It just seems to me that from a public policy perspective, there's something to be done there that builds in some security, but also responsibility on the part of homeowners and government for, getting the costs kind of managed somehow.
Yeah. Well, right now, there's a couple of components to Public Safety Canada manages the federal disaster relief program of monies coming to the province for reimbursements, but in reference to people that live in flood zones or highly problematic zones where they're uninsurable right now, it's basically a moving target as to how to address this. What's the optimal means of doing so? And there's about 10% of the categories of homes in Canada that are just in this zone, physical zone even, of uninsurability, and literally being worked out in real time. And I go to various of these meetings. We're looking at what's the mechanism, what's the model, what's the optimal model to help move people out of these zones and encourage them to do so, but at the same time still compensating people who don't have the option to do so. And how do we, ultimately though, how do we do this most cost effectively? It's a very tricky animal, because the other day I happened to be with Craig Snodgrass, who is the mayor of High River in Alberta, which got hit very, very hard with flooding. And he talked about the formidability of the challenge he faced when they actually had to go out to homeowners, and the province and the city, they picked up the bill to actually move people out of flood zones so they're not in a repeated situation of where they're trying to compensate them in some form or another because they didn't have insurance. But on an annual basis, they were paying money out under the scenario you described. And in this case, they just said finally they had to have the tough discussion with them, that they actually have to move, and whether they like it or not. And and I must admit, I felt for the guy, because he says, you're looking people in the eye that have lived somewhere for 55 years, that's their home, and they got to move. But that's the reality of the situation. So I don't really have a good answer for your question. It's a moving target right now, and I see lots of scenarios of how to address this. I'm at lots of meetings where we're trying to come up with a solution of how to do it optimally. But we have to do what you're saying, because the current system of just building back and to the standard they had, it's not working. It's just too costly. There was a, yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. My question goes beyond Canada. There were countries, especially that are struggling with this climate change as well.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, what would you say to those countries that they don't have either the means to obtain this kind of technology, to institute in this and kind of protect themselves from flooding, and which pretty much or essentially are adapting is not an option because they don't have the means to actually do it. So what in your opinion will you say to economies or countries that are struggling with it?
Well, I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you part of the answer is of where we can get the funding and the help for them. And it's a combination of the World Bank, IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And it's being led primarily, the scenario you're just saying, the desirability of it to help the disenfranchised, I don't like the expression third world countries, but that's what we use, developing countries. The effort is being led disproportionately by the United States. And of the 5 agencies in Washington that work on this, and I work with all of them, about 3 times a year I'm there, between the Department of Defense, or the Pentagon, Homeland Security, NASA, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the EPA. Between those 5 agencies, you know who understands climate change the best by far? Department of Defense, by far. And it's because the mandate of the Department of Defense changed about 8 or 9 years ago from not just fighting wars, but to focus on preventing wars. And they look at the degree to which we can bring adaptation to climate change to countries. Countries basically go to war. Other wars break out within or between countries because people are trying to gain access to limiting resources, food, water supply, etc. So the Pentagon looks at it as the greater the degree to which we can bring adaptation to those countries, the greater the probability is we're going to lower the chances of violent conflicts breaking out. So it's now in the vested interest of, in this case, the United States, to help these otherwise disenfranchised countries. And so that's the model, or at least that's one aspect of the system. And also, though, I believe some of you might remember Gary Hart, who ran for president maybe 20 years ago or something. And quite frankly, he would have been president, but his libido got the better of him. He had an affair, and that kind of killed the whole thing. But independent of not being able to control his libido, he's a very smart fellow. And I was at a meeting a little while ago that he led, and there was only about 15 or 16 people there. But what he did at this meeting in reference to climate change and extreme weather events and the formidability of it in helping disenfranchised countries, he basically went through, he started with a dissertation in this case in the United States. This was at the Pentagon. And he went through the independence and the founding fathers of the U.S., the American Civil War, what went on there. He brought it up through the First World War, League of Nations, United Nations, Marshall Plan, IMF, World Bank, brought it right up to the present, and then said, however, all of these organizations are structured and designed with a vested interest usually of the equivalent of a G7, G8 countries or G20 countries in mind. He said, it's the wrong structure for the disenfranchised countries of the world, even the World Bank. And he said, what we need to do is focus on the formulation of a new body that can address these outstanding challenges. And personally, I agree with it. And so I just don't think we're there yet. You know, we're looking at it, but we're not there yet. And even when we talk about things like, countries still think about their borders from a climate change perspective. In other words, when you emit greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, it enters into the commons, and everybody suffers. So it doesn't really matter where the gases came from. The climate change is changing all over the place. Where the origin of the gases, the manifestation of the negative impact could be anywhere in the world. But yet we're still looking at a system, even coming out of COP21, where we're leaning towards what will individual countries do to lower their emissions, to hopefully keep overall emissions to 1.52 degrees Celsius. But what they're not thinking about, they're still thinking about Canada's emissions and US emissions and Mexico's emissions, and the list goes on. But spending within individual countries to lower individual country emissions. And I'm not sure that's the best system, and I'm not an expert on this topic. But if it were me, and let's say we had Canada looking at spending $50 million to lower greenhouse gas emissions through some technology related to tar sands in Alberta. If it turns out that that same $50 million could be spent in Costa Rica and lower twice the level of emissions that we might realize in Alberta, and given that the emissions are in the global commons, why aren't we deploying that money somewhere else to get twice the bang for the buck? Because at the end of the day, what we want is less CO2 in the atmosphere. But politically, you can't sell it. It still is in the mind frame of the people that, no, we've got to lower our emissions. And I used to work for Morris Strong at Ontario Power Generation. Some of you may remember Morris Strong. He was the first chairman of the Real Earth Summit in 1992. He died not too long ago. And Morris had a very active program. We had at Ontario Power Generation of tree planting and restoration in Costa Rica. The political fallout was huge. People could not figure out why we're helping the global commons by doing work in Costa Rica versus doing it in Canada. But the bang for the buck, in terms of this case, it was addressing greenhouse impacts, was such that we got more bang for the buck there than here, at least in our determination. But there's a political component to this stuff that you always have to think about. And I can tell you, even on the home adaptation assessment program, which I'm kind of wandering from your question a little bit, but the part of the other reason it's working is that there's a lot of political capital in it. If you're a mayor or a councillor or an MP, an MPP, whatever, you don't really have to worry too much about some member of a constituency getting mad at you because you tried to engage a program whereby they won't have a flooded basement. You know, it kind of works. There's not a big downside to it, no matter how you slice it. But let's say you look at something, I'm kind of off your question now, but let's say you look at something like floodplain maps, which to this group probably seems pretty obvious. Of course we would do it. Well, that's not so easy sometimes when you're out in the public domain. I've been in many council chambers with mayors and councillors at times talking about this stuff that I thought, you know what, I'm going to be very lucky to get my rear end from this chamber back into my car in one piece before these guys get a piece of me, you know. But fortunately, I'm little and I can run fast. But because you can have developers sitting there who have just spent $30 million over here to buy a tract of land, and all of a sudden I come along, or people like me come along, and they say, no, we're going to produce up-to-date floodplain maps, and now it turns out you've red tagged this zone over here where where they've just spent $30 million. Then you're going to go, I'm sorry, you know, we want to build there, and I'm not going to lose that money. And by the way, I've lived in this area for 30 years, and I've never seen flooding over there. I think we're not sure climate change is even real, by the way. You're probably just chasing a red herring. Or sometimes you have members of council. I mean, not everybody is enlightened as perhaps might be in this room. You have councillors who look at it and go, no, we want to put 2,500 homes in over here, and we want the property tax revenue base associated with those homes coming into our coffers. And quite frankly, Dr. Feltmate, we're not sure even any of this stuff you're talking about is true, you know? So how this does, though, relate to your question is you have to think about political capital. I mean, that's the reality of this situation. I spend my whole life in front of mayors and premiers and ministers and deputy ministers and everybody else. And that's how they think. So you've got to get inside of their head. And even at the national level or helping internationally, you still have to think, if you're Trudeau or whoever it is, you've got to think of what's the political capital in this. They always do. So when you make an argument, make sure you address that up front. It's good for, the first thing it is you're going to make them look good. Yes. I can hear, just yell, yeah.
I'd like to just continue your discussion because I've been in that situation as a planner in floodplain mapping. And it's amazing how people will say their land flooded in March and you're at a public meeting in May. It never floods here.
Yeah.
So my big problem with all of this has been, how do we change people's mindsets? Political capital is one, but political capital comes from ordinary people putting pressure on their politicians. And how do we educate the public that some of these things have to happen? Why is it that once you do the mapping, all of a sudden this is real, but if you don't show it on the map, that doesn't mean it won't flood. But they think by putting it on the map, it's definitely going to flood.
Yeah.
You see, it's that kind of a difficulty that we deal with. And I don't know how to get around that, honestly.
It's a fantastic question. As a matter of fact, it's the one I spend a great deal of my time thinking about now. The challenge that we're facing, by and large, very often, is not technical in nature. The challenge we're facing is social engineering, if you will. It sounds a little, Machiavellian, but and the way I look at it, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I actually mean it. If you look at something like, so you have to bear with me for 30 seconds and hopefully it makes sense. If you look at something like, for example, Tim Hortons, you will see cars lined up, 17 cars deep, in a lineup to get to a little booth to buy mediocre coffee and Timbits. And somehow, really smart people at Tim Hortons have figured out how to influence the behavior of the masses such that they can draw these people in. It's almost, how do we take that same creativity, that creative mindset, and apply it to real problems? And I think, increasingly so, I think we need politicians that have a bit more strength, but persuasive capacity to convince people that it's in their best interest. And as challenging as that might be. And I know I've spent like 25 years in corporate boardrooms developing sustainable development programs. And one thing I've learned is that people, corporations, and governments are motivated by arguments based on self-interest. Self-interest motivates. Philosophically, whether that's desirable or not is a different topic. But by and large, and I don't mean everybody, but on average. So we've got to build an element of what's in it for them into the equation to do the right thing. And really what happens is, and by the way, I'm not convinced at all, even on the mitigation end of the equation, that Canadians are really on board on this file. They say they are, but I live in Toronto, and I have to travel to do stuff like this. But when as much as everybody says they're committed to lowering their greenhouse gas emissions, where I live anyhow, and I'm positive it'll be the same right across the country or in the US or anywhere else, it still is the case on a long weekend in September. You can't get out of where I live, Toronto, albeit for 6 hours of traffic of people heading out of the city on every road conceivable, trying to get to cottages that are 3 and 4 hours away to drive motorboats and jet skis. In other words, I don't see everybody staying home and saying, I'm not going there because I want to lower my greenhouse gas profile or footprint, right? On the March break, it will be, in March break, every airport in this country will be packed with people trying to get down to the Caribbean or wherever it is to go on cruise ships, and they'll be packed. I don't see them all staying home and saying, I'm not going to go there because it's too much of a carbon footprint. People are committed until all of a sudden it comes to lifestyle change, and they really have to give something up, and all of a sudden they go, oh, hey, I didn't know that's what you meant. So there is no underestimating the challenge that's before us, both on the mitigation end of the equation and on the adaptation end of the equation. But for me, the current strategy is, let's get some early wins here with some low-hanging fruit. So the two things I spend my time on is the Home Adaptation Assessment Program, and the other is a program we're launching, I didn't get to here, but provincially and or federally, but probably provincially, it's focusing on, it's called a Natural Infrastructure Adaptation Program. And in short, what it amounts to is retaining the natural integrity of wetlands within and around major Canadian cities as risk mitigators themselves. Because when the big storms hit, if you pave these things over and the water hits, it's got nowhere to go. It goes downstream and causes flooding. So one adaptation measure is simply leave the wetlands intact so they can absorb the water and allow it to discharge slowly over time. Natural riparian buffer zones along flowing water systems, retaining the natural sinuosity of streams, the way they meander around. That's an adaptation measure in and of itself that takes risk out of the system. So that's in the, what I would call, in the low-hanging fruit end of the equation, where we can take a lot of risk out of the system for not very much money. And my job is to convince the politicians. So every argument I put forth focuses on what is the return on investment. Every discussion starts out every time, 95% of the time, with what's it going to cost and what are we going to get for it. And if you can't put this into dollar cost, return on investment, you're probably dead in the water. So what I work on with the Home Adaptation Assessment Program, I can say for $1 in here, and I can defend it with a lot of detail, but for $1 spent here, on average, we're going to save between $6 and $8 relative to avoided flood losses over a 10-year period. And that's a conservative estimate. They love that, because they can sell that to the public. But if you went in trying to sell the program without that data, oh, you're way behind the 8 ball. Retaining natural wetlands. What we're working on now is looking at how compensating a landowner who has a wetland, let's say worth $3 million, and he or she wants to sell it off because that's their retirement income. What's the cost effectiveness of, let's say it's the province, buying that land, compensating that person at fair market value to not sell it off, but also give them the value that they would like to live on, spend the $3 million investment to retain as a wetland, and by the way, we can make a calculation to show that that's going to save $21 million over a 15-year period for downstream flooding that didn't occur. And if you look at something like, you guys are probably scared to ask questions, then just go on for an hour. But if you look at the Winnipeg, there's a major dike that goes around the city of Winnipeg, developed by a guy by the name of Duff Robin, who was premier there in 1969, I think this was built. He actually got it voted out of office based on this thing. And I forget the numbers right now, but I think it was $70 million, $100 million at the time to build this thing. It's now been calculated, this thing has paid for itself 100 times over. So forward-looking leaders, for flooding that hasn't occurred in downtown Winnipeg, is challenging as their challenges still are. But the point is, with the right leadership, you can get systems in place, in my opinion.
Yeah. Question, you didn't talk about it too much, but shelter's one thing that humans we need. Agriculture, is there risk there as well? And I don't know if you can comment on that. I imagine it could be another night of talking. And linked to agriculture is food supply, which I would say, leads to how many people can Earth sustain. And so I guess my simple question is, do you think that there will be some type of global birth control type of regulation or social policies? Will it happen in our lifetime, or will it be economic situation and constraints that curb population growth?
Well, you hit a bunch of topics there, and to be fair, I won't go on for an hour about each, but I could. But in terms of food supply, security of food supply, I'm right at this right now. Matter of fact, I'm looking at hiring a bunch of people to work on this exact issue for Canada. And part of what's influencing my decision, because you can't work on everything, but at least where I'm from, in Ontario, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change there, Glenn Murray, every talk he gives about climate change has 30 minutes on agriculture, food supply, security of food supply, how the cost of food is going up, and he can tell you the price of cashews and everything and how much water demand there is for this stuff that all comes from California where there's a drought. So I thought, you know what, why don't we do something on this topic and look at security of food supply in Canada and its vulnerability and what we can do from a climate change extreme weather event to try to lower the risk profile. So matter of fact, right now, one of the people I'm bringing into the equation who knows a heck of a lot about this topic in very practical terms, he used to be the Vice President of Sustainable Development or Sustainability for Sobeys, which you would know well here, working with some climate scientists. So I don't know what we're going to do on it, but we're going to do something on it. And it's another one of these tricky topics that, by the way, has some ticking time bombs in it. Like, in other words, if you want to have a free and open discussion about food security against climate change, Do we bring genetically modified crops into the equation? And with most people, crops that can grow under different regimes of temperature, precipitation, etc. Well, that's a challenge that right away, you almost have two camps of people emerge immediately. Those are totally in favor, totally against, and very little gray room in between. It's a difficult discussion to have just an informed debate or discussion on. But I think for the challenge of food security, we have to look at all potential tools in the toolbox. In terms of population and control, it's another very, very tricky topic. I was at a meeting a little while ago that there was about 40 people in this meeting. About a third academics, a third NGOs, a third government, and then a few others mixed in. And during this meeting, 2 or 3 people brought up the point, and they directed accolades towards the Pope in terms of his recent statements in an encyclical pertaining to the formidability of climate change, and it needs to be addressed, which I obviously agree with. And then a few other people, so 2 or 3 people made that mention, and then it came back in, as more part of a discussion. So I thought, well, I would like to comment on this. And I applaud the Pope for bringing the world's attention to this challenge from the perspective of the head of the Catholic Church. But then I also said, in reference to family planning and addressing climate change and too many people on the planet, what should the Catholic Church's position be, or leadership from the Pope, in terms of family planning, birth control? And holy cow, you would have thought, I let a skunk go in the room or something, right? It was like I got shut down instantly. And it was, we cannot go there, we cannot have that. Like, they thought I was attacking the Pope, which I'm not, I'm just saying we have to consider this issue, because too many people on the planet, I don't know if it was you or who, you just said, how do we know when we're over capacity? I can tell you, we're over capacity right now. We're already over capacity. And so we need to bring all options to the table of how do we lower population growth. And I don't just mean the Catholic Church, religions as a whole should be brought to the table in reference to family planning. Educating women. It happens, it's very effective in overall lowering birth rates just through the empowerment of women through education. So why aren't we having that discussion? But in terms of shooting beyond carrying capacity, for example, since we first started cutting trees down on this planet in appreciable numbers, it started about 10,000 years ago, we've removed an area of forest from the surface of the earth slightly larger than the United States. Like, that's gone for good, paved over. That's a pretty good indicator. When you remove an area of forest from the surface of the earth the size of the United States, that kind of says you're having an impact. We've got 17 major fisheries in the world, 14 of them out of state of decline, at or worse than we've seen off of Canada's east and west coasts. We see the exacerbation of wars breaking out. I'm not at the Pentagon for amusement. I'm there because we're talking about the linkage between environmental degradation and violent conflicts, which is very, very real. So we're going to have, talk about Syrian refugees, we're going to have hundreds of millions of people dislocated through rising sea levels. I was in Miami last week for speaking at something, and something as close by as Miami, sea level in the area of Miami right now is up about 10 to 12 centimeters, higher than where it was 40 years ago. During king tides or the high tides, with storm surges, Miami is now flooding out on a regular basis. Downtown Miami is flooding out regularly. But that phenomena is being seen in localities all around the world. So when you're at meetings and people talk about sea level rise going up to 1 meter and 2 meters, it's a nonsensical discussion. We're going to be so far into World War III long before that occurs. That we're never going to get there. So but we have to start thinking about the challenge we're facing on the planet as a global enterprise, not as a single country entity. And that's the reality. And that is enlightened self-interest, by the way. That's not altruism or benevolence. That's enlightened self-interest. And, so that's what I think.
Thank you for being so generous with your time. I think we can bring this lecture to a close. there's lots of ideas here, lots of thoughts, and I think as somebody like Janice Harvey here as well, who tries to teach climate change or tries to stay up with the changes in climate change, the perspective you've brought here is really interesting, really unique. You have this incredibly varied and fascinating background in this as well, so it's been a pleasure to hear you talk about this today.